Hello, I'm Chris Blask. I'm Vice President of Strategy with Cybeats, and with me today is a good friend, Barry Suskind. Barry, how are you?
Good.
Where are you?
So I'm just outside Washington, D.C., and I work for FINRA. I'm a senior director running a threat detection and response team, and been in the cybersecurity realm for a pretty long time.
Long time. And I mean, for the last couple of years, you and I and a bunch of our idiot friends have been talking a lot of Fridays about a lot of things, right? And it's interesting, as we were explaining in the green room before this, right? This is a conversational sort of thing. And aside from everything else I do for a living, whatever the heck that is, it just fascinates me. I get my most satisfaction out of just talking to my friends, right? Because at this point in our lives, we're this general age we're at, we've distributed the early cyber people are doing things 30 years ago and so forth. And again, our Friday call is amazing. I don't know if I've actually stopped to think of the actual organizations everybody's related to, right? And it's, we get to take this subject really seriously, but not in the way we did 30 years ago, right? It's a more mature, developed area. As we're talking about before this, right? Your path through the financial sector, right? I've been cross-sector everything all my life. I love critical infrastructure and OT and ICS for lots of reasons. Love banks for lots of reasons. Very practical, pragmatic, evolutionary. And since we're in the supply chain security world, which looks to me a lot like threat intelligence and ISACs and ISOs, and can I really share information? Am I giving away all the secrets? Does it make it easier for the bad guys? Yada, yada, yada. So we're getting to the level in cybersecurity at large, I think, where the audience, the subject matter is developed enough, the audience is broad enough, the conversation needs to get to that level of sophistication that I frankly think you're at these days. So if Anthony, episode 41, right? Look at that. Anthony, if you could roll the first question, looking back, right? You're, every one of us, I don't know, it's impossible to have done this for 30 years and have meant to, right? So you've been following this path, in the financial sector, right? And this, sorry, I'll get off my story in a minute, let you talk, but late 90s when I got to Cisco, right? And you become the one everyone's always talking about. Why don't vendors just do this right? Why don't they just build it in the first place? Why didn't we make security right in the first place? You were there, in the early stages of cybersecurity, working in the financial sector environment, to kick off that first looking at the past, how we developed the transparency, why was it impossible to make this all clear and simple in the first place in your world?
Yeah. It dates back to my previous job. I wasn't in the financial sector at that time. And we were e-commerce, putting things on the internet. And we went in with a third party and we were going to rebrand their system. And I took a look at it and found that while they did a great job at putting authentication on the front door, they neglected to protect any of the back end pages. So you could get into administration without logging in. My mantra back then, and it's been that way for 30 years, is come to me early. I'll help you design the security into the product. Come to me late, there are going to be issues. And it still is today. And a lot of it's just business. Business gets their way. So when they stack up the list of things that need to be done, security always ends up at the bottom. Fortunately, I can say this, I'm thankful that when we moved into, we're very large footprint in Amazon, we greenfield. And I was able to do something that I tried to do when we went to virtualization in the data center, and that's microsegment applications. Applications don't need to talk to each other. They only need to talk amongst themselves with itself and only on a limited number of ports. So I've accomplished that in Amazon. So we don't have crosstalk there. But the piece that we still are trying to crack is the whole software bill of materials, the SBOM thing. The development team seems to feel that SBOM is what you put into it. So here's what we need to build this thing. The problem is, and I see a lot of companies having this problem, is they don't check to see what's in there after they built it. How many things were added onto this? How many dependencies did you add into this thing, how many libraries, how many other pieces of source code, how many scripts got pulled into this that weren't in your software bill of materials. And now you got a problem, because what are the vulnerabilities of the things you put in there? Are you running the latest release? Do you know what it's doing? So hard to crack there. And, I'd love to be able to properly vet out everything at the beginning, meaning, do we know what's going into this product? And are we sure that there are no vulnerabilities in what we're putting into this?
Well, it's that dynamic between, you touched on both sides. Business sometimes just allows. And to be clear, business may be you and I. We start a company tomorrow, and we end up with these pragmatic realities of the two of us. We have this much budget. It's not, a huge company, and we got timelines and challenges and so forth. And then security people come along and say, you need to do these things. I see so much, Fred Cohen and I do this kind of all the time. It's a fascinating thread for me in this is, as you said, if you just want to sit down first and let's think this through from a security perspective, I'll tell you how to do it. If you want to just sit down first and think about this from a business perspective and think it all through, I'll tell you how to do it. But it turns out in neither case is that how people do things. Usually when it's a little startup company, it only has, Cybeats, great example. A couple of folks, all sorts of challenges, the usual sort of, high-tech thing. How do you make the choice to put enough thought in, and my title, strategy? How much time do you spend on strategy when just not falling over in your, is your biggest challenge? And I don't know how I kind of look, my opinion of the past is it's pragmatic enough. When we launched in '92, I think it was launched the first firewall thing that I was involved with. And the first show, someone walked up and said, "I'm from OT. I'm in, an oil refinery. What do you do for me?" And I just come from there, and I just forgot about it. And I was like, "Oh my God, nothing." And it turns out we couldn't, because it's 6 dogs in a garage, startup company, and it's e-commerce, right? And it's eventually the banks. It's all of that was all the business in the early '90s. We couldn't take half a person's time for a week to do something for an oil refinery. And then in 2000, the same thing at Cisco. The big money, the picks and the firewall lines making tens of millions of dollars a month. We still couldn't take one engineer and put him on OT stuff. When we had a lineup, again, from everything you were involved in, the e-commerce to the banks getting involved and driving all the business turn of the century. So maybe we couldn't have gotten there earlier. But, and looking, Anthony, throw the second question in there. Let's talk about the present a little bit. The ROI, the return on investment of transparency. I've been trying to put these things together myself for that same period of time. But I think we're at this point right now where the ROI and transparency is well framed already. I think globally, capitalism has worked, one in our lifetimes. The old, communism and central control are going to do it. You got to federate and distribute it. Capitalism, quote unquote, for all that means, these economic systems. The internet, the same thing. Do you think we're at a cusp? Do you see information sharing, everything from threat intel and how the companies work together, and that's getting better?
Fortunately, in the financial sector, we've got FSISAC, which is probably one of the best ones out there. And we've actually actively participated in that, where we were actually sending them malware. Here's what we saw in a piece of malware. You don't have this anywhere. You need to let people know. And they have a good plan of no attribution, and they put that out as an alert to other people without saying where it came from. And, we're happy when we see the alerts come back and we go like, well, we told them that. And we see other people doing that. There's still a lag time in it, but at least we know that we're sharing information and we're getting information back from them, not only in the cyber realm, but in the physical realm and all kinds of other things. I see a lot of advancement going on with CISA, and we also have requirements to share information with the SEC. So we have required reporting arrangements. The biggest challenge, I think, for most companies has been FOIA and a fear of, I don't want to tell them that. I don't want that to end up in a public notice that got put out there. But I think they're putting in some protections on that.
Well, yeah, I think the D-bomb press release digital material debum.io. Just finally went out to the Alliance Foundation this week, and Cybeats was a in that. I think, again, I'm biased on that side, but I think those technical structures that are coming along because of other reasons that might help even those sort of FOIA concerns. But the everything you talked about with the FSI SAC, I say this a lot in the current conversations about supply chain, and it's been interesting over the last 3-4 years how bringing in ISACs and threat intelligence, a lot of this conversation doesn't work. You got enough on your plate right now just figuring out SBOM at all. And because ISACs and threat intel, as you mentioned, FSI SAC is amazing. Bill Nelson, started that, and he was on a panel with a couple other folks at one of James Nesbitt's Cyber Senate things. I was moderating, or replaying all that. And in that time, the financial sector was always sharing information. Like you say, you've got requirements to share information with government bodies all the time. You're literally sharing information, money with each other all the time, the banks and the brokers and everybody. So of all the sectors, there's a lot of institutional knowledge already in how we need to do this cyber stuff and this networking, information sharing stuff. And so on the one hand, FSI SAC is a great example, very functional. On the other hand, I think we're still in that evolutionary phase where the ISACs formed around just the vendors, the integrators basically can't be involved. And now we're in the supply chain world where it's like, oh, wait, the vendors and integrators and the banks and the brokers and the nonprofits and everybody else involved, actually, you have to be involved. And I think the supply chain issue is forcing that. So, so Anthony, if you put the last one up, right? As you explained, these are jokey questions, but since I'm thinking economics and so forth in your context, the real question is, do we keep driving towards more transparency? Or all these fundamentals we talk about in, whether it's in capitalist business systems, the businesses make agreements and contracts and live by them and, have responsibilities and consequences, or is the technical part or the procedural part of security, are we driving towards further transparency, do you think, because of these, like, take it any direction you want, but FSI SAC is a good place to start.
Oh, yeah. Well, I think that vendors are kind of being compelled to be more transparent, because I know we have a third-party risk assessment. Anytime we get a third party, got to have a risk assessment of third party. What are their policies, standards, practices? And then we start asking them supply chain questions. And we went around all our vendors. Are you vulnerable to Log4j? Are you vulnerable to Log4Shell? And we can't be unique in that. I know other companies are doing this. So vendors are kind of getting pushed into this space where some of them now, they already have stuff all ready to go and they just snap and they can provide the reports. There are things out there like BitSite that just go scan everything. And we can just go take a look and go like, well, what's their website look like? Do they have vulnerabilities that we know about? And start asking questions. So some of this capitalism it's following it because it must. I mean, if you want to keep making money and you still want to have customers, you sort of have to raise your game up a little bit in order to have those customers because they're now scrutinizing you more. For us, it's, again, open source, so it's like, can we get this cheaper without having to reinvent the wheel every time? Are there things out there, widgets that we can grab that are, without having to do this? Low code, no code solutions. Some of this it's an evolutionary thing. But it still gets back to the question of, in the end, do you know what you have in the soup that you just made?
Well, right. And then that's why I like the economic, anvil to bend this on, because it is evolutionary. Ideologically, is there some Star Trek future where everything's free? We don't live in that world, right? The reality is, if you want to be a business and exist, and your competitor finds a way to lower their costs, increase their competitiveness, and you don't, evolution takes a hand. A couple of years you're not around, everybody's doing that. And, so many of the realities we deal with, right? Whether it's Citibank and their 40,000 programs, right? You get mathematically these points where it's like, all right, the cost of physically handling all this, or to your point about sort of software inventory, of not addressing it all, and just waiting until something happens, drives the evolutionary crux, right? So, I don't know. I mean, generally, right? You optimistic for this theme? Long term. Do you think the world has lots of challenges? You can list those all day long. However, we lived through a couple of crazy years. The world's still here. We're doing amazing things in space. Do you think
I think it's going to get better, but there are certain things that I was amazed at SolarWinds. That was like the first big supply chain hack. And the thing that amazed me the most is, we spoke with one of the major consulting firms about what the rest of the industry was seeing and found out that over 70% of the companies out there still haven't locked down their outbound internet. It's open. And I'm like, good grief. I did that 30 years ago. That was a requirement. Why are these people not doing this? It's hard. It's time consuming. It costs money. And it's just easier to do the other thing. Hey, if we protect people from ever getting in, we don't have to worry about what goes out. And, again, people are learning through pain and suffering where you're getting hacked, you're having data exfiltrated, and you're realizing that, this is a serious problem. You need to work to secure those things.
Well, I don't. You mentioned SolarWinds makes me think of Stuxnet, and with all respect to the great American philosopher Forrest Gump, right? I feel like that a lot of the time because when Stuxnet hit, I was working in OT cyber, and so and when SolarWinds and all that, I'm focusing on supply chain. So I'm kind of not surprised in both cases. There was after Stuxnet, there was a La Presse, the French newspaper journalist called me up, to get a comment and really, really wanted me to say, isn't the U.S. throwing stones? If the U.S. is in fact behind this, aren't you living in a glass house and throwing stones? And I was trying honestly to get across the point. Because the same thing I feel about SolarWinds is like it's time. If you think about critical infrastructure security, you think about supply chain security long enough, you're going to be right. And I think we were just hitting that spot. And, I think we have the tools to get through this. The short term is always a problem. You can sink any boat. Boats in general, will last forever.
Yeah.
But a lot of work to be done.
Well, some of the things that I think that need to be done is you need to look at it holistically. You can't just look at, one area. You need to look overall. You need to look at a lot of different things because there's lots of blind alleys that people haven't even realized were there. And believe me, the hackers are going to figure it out. And that's the problem that, you only have a limited number of security people looking at things where you have an infinite number of hackers out there looking at everything. And they're just trying to fuzz their way through.
Right. Well, this is how I end up with inevitability curves, right? There's aspects of that to me that look like if they continue on existing paths, never meet, in which case we never solve this, right? And never is a long time, thousands of years. I mean, all of human history, future, we don't figure it out. But I see glimmers of hope.
Yeah, it's a big cat and mouse game. I mean, much like trying to have private messages. I mean, you go back to the Romans and they were writing the messages on a long piece, on a piece of paper. They'd wrap it around something and they'd write it down, a thing like this, and they'd unwrap it. And here's this piece of paper. You can't decipher it unless you have a pole with the right diameter. That didn't last. And then you move on and you move on and you move on. And now we're at the cusp of quantum computers that's going to blow it all up. Then you're going to have to come up with, it's constantly this game of cat and mouse. And will we achieve perfection and security? It's hard to tell. I think we're going to get better. We'll get better at it. We'll be more transparent. There'll be more information sharing. Hopefully that the time can reduce. That's what you want to do. You got to reduce the time so that, the time between somebody finding something and you actually doing something about it. If you can shrink that down, you're going to be better off.
I can't think of a better way to end it because, time is in fact all of it.
Yeah.
So, Barry, thank you very much for your time today, for everything done in the industry and all the Fridays that have kept me sane.
Yep. Great. Happy to be here. It's fun.
Thanks, folks. Bye.
Thanks.